He mourns the fall of the Soviet Union, calling it the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He praises Stalin's victories, but bans Soviet-style communism. He rebuilds the Orthodox Church, resurrects Tsarist symbols, and claims a divine mission to protect the Russian world. Putin is a man of contradictions. He wants to be feared like Stalin and worshipped like a Tsar. So, which is it? Is Vladimir Putin the new Stalin, or is he the latest Tsar of Russia? In 2024, Vladimir Putin was re-elected in what the Kremlin called a democratic election. But of course it was no election, right? Rather, it was a coronation. There was no real opposition, no free press, and no international observers. It was pure performance. Pretty much just an imperial ritual to legitimize permanent power. Of course, any real political opposition in Russia is silenced. Weeks before the vote, Alexei Navalny, Russia's most prominent opposition leader, died in prison. He had survived poisoning, only to be imprisoned and silenced. After his death, mourners were arrested. In Putin's Russia, even grief is criminal. Political freedom? Gone. Just to give an example, calling the war in Ukraine a war can get you 15 years. Economic freedom? A myth. Billionaires exist, of course, but wealth means nothing without Kremlin loyalty. And surveillance, well, close to total. Speech is criminalized, the internet is censored, VPNs are banned, social media blocked, say the wrong thing and lose your job, your freedom, or your life. In short, freedom in Russia, assuming that it ever existed, is at least today completely dead. But to understand what kind of ruler Vladimir Putin really is, we have to go backward. But not just to the Cold War or the Soviet collapse. We need to go much further back, before Lenin, before communism. Back to a time where Russia wasn't a so-called union of republics, but an empire. In the 19th century, Tsar Nicholas I formalized a ruling philosophy that defined the Russian Empire: Orthodoxy, Autocracy, and Nationality. It was more than just a slogan, it was political theology, a belief system. Autocracy meant absolute, centralized rule. No constitution, no parliament, no liberty. Orthodoxy referred to the state's alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church as a spiritual enforcer of obedience. And nationality meant suppressing ethnic minorities and elevating Russian identity as divine and superior. Now, this system, of course, legitimized, justified an enormous degree of oppression. And in the 21st century, Putin is reviving every pillar of this imperial structure. Firstly, just as with the Tsarist regime, we see absolute power centered in one man. Under the Tsarist regime, Tsars ruled as autocrats by divine right. They issued decrees, commanded armies, and imprisoned dissenters without trial. The rulers had no checks, no balances, and no accountability. Putin governs with similar absolutism. The Russian Duma functions as a rubber stamp. Judges are loyal to the Kremlin. Regional governors are hand-picked or forced into obedience. And of course, the Russian constitution has been rewritten to extend Putin's rule until at least 2036. Second, orthodoxy. Again, just as under the Tsarist regime, religion is used as a moral justification for rule. The Russian Orthodox Church was a wing of the Tsarist state. It preached obedience to the Tsar as obedience to God. Heresy was a crime. The church educated, censored, and sanctified imperial authority. Today, Patriarch Kirill calls Putin's rule divinely ordained. He has blessed the war in Ukraine as a holy mission to protect the Russian world. Church and state are fused again. This time, not just to preserve regime support, but to legitimize aggressive warfare. The church doesn't challenge Putin, it anoints him. It legitimizes his power. Third, nationalism. The Tsarist regime promoted a singular national identity. To be Russian was to be Orthodox, obedient and loyal. Ethnic minorities were Russified, local languages were banned, and of course resistance was branded as treason. Today Putin uses the same logic. He insists that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. He promotes the ideology of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, a civilizational concept claiming that Russia has a historic spiritual right to rule over all former imperial territories. His justification for the invasion of Ukraine is not based on borders, but on the idea of imperial destiny. And just like the Tsars, he rewrites history to legitimize it. So what about Stalinism? Now, some argue that Putin is trying to be the new Stalin. And it's true, he does share some of Stalin's paranoia, as well as of course the centralization of power and taste for repression aspects of this regime. But ideologically, they are worlds apart. Stalin was a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary. He sought to transform society, not preserve it. He collectivized property, enforced class struggle, built a system based on materialist theory and mass industrial mobilization. And though many people today, especially modern communists, spent a lot of effort trying to argue that Stalin was not a real communist. And though it is true that Stalin's regime diverged a lot from the ideal communist utopia envisioned by Marx, Stalin was in fact an ideologue. And throughout his life, he produced numerous theoretical works that were explicitly aimed at defining and defending his vision of Marxist-Leninism. As such, Stalin represented an ideology which holds as its main purpose the realization of a communist utopia. One which is to arise after a communist revolution and a transition period known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Of course, de facto run by a vanguard party on behalf of the proletariat itself. This idea of a vanguard party, of course, being Lenin's idea. I mean, great idea, right? What could go wrong? Putin, on the other hand, is not a revolutionary. He is a restorationist. He does not dream of a classless society. He dreams of rebuilding a mighty ordered empire. Stalin executed priests. Putin kneels before them. Putin's regime isn't about socialism. It's about symbolism. It's about civilizational glory. And it's about unlimited power and how to maintain it. Now, let me give you the recipe for maintaining power. To maintain power, you must have some degree of ideological control over your population. To do that, you need legitimacy. To get legitimacy, you need symbols. Symbols that people accept as greater than themselves. Identify yourself with those symbols, those ideas, and you can rule as long and as hard as you wish, as long as you maintain the narrative. So who is Putin copying? Like Stalin, he silences critics and rules through fear. But like the Tsars, he sanctifies power, glorifies empire, and makes obedience a religious virtue. Putin's Russia is not a reincarnation of the USSR. It is a rebirth of the empire that came before it. Some people will shrug and say, well, it's just Russia. As if authoritarianism is a cultural curiosity, an exception, somewhere far away out there in the world, right? As if it exists in a vacuum, distant, isolated, irrelevant to the rest of us. But if you care about liberty, if you truly care, then Russia matters deeply. Because Russia is not just a country ruled by an authoritarian. It's a case study in how freedom is kept suppressed. Not with a bang, but with ritual, with propaganda, with fear wrapped in patriotism, with pride, or in reality, the illusion of pride. Because what's happening in Russia is not unique to Russians. It's a template, a warning, a mirror. Because this is how tyranny works. Putin didn't kill freedom overnight. He didn't announce dictatorship. He didn't roll tanks into parliament. He did it gradually, legally, ceremonially, while people applauded him. He silenced dissent by branding critics as foreign agents. He rewrote the constitution, expanding his power under the guise of reform. He rewrote history, turning textbooks into weapons of loyalty. He turned obedience into virtue and turned any degree of resistance into treason. As per usual, people weren't just coerced, they were persuaded. Taught to fear chaos more than control. Taught to see freedom not as a right but as a threat to stability. Repression through engineered dependency. A society trained to look up at their leader, not around. To comply with orders, not question them. And it doesn't stop at the border. Putin's regime exports more than oil and propaganda. It exports a model of permanent power, mythologized leadership and controlled memory. And the longer it survives, the more appealing it becomes to would-be strongmen around the world, left, right or otherwise. Leaders who admire control, who envy how easy it is in Russia to criminalize disagreement, to silence journalists. Because power is what it is and human psychology is what it is. So if it can happen in Russia, it can happen anywhere. That is why this matters. So no, this isn't just Russia's story. It's a warning for every society that gets too comfortable. Every nation that starts to value security over liberty. Every citizen who stops asking questions because it's easier not to. Freedom is fragile. And the more we look away from places like Russia, the more likely we are to repeat their path. So is Putin a Tsar? Yes, in pretty much everything but name. He rules for life, controls the courts, parliament and press. He shapes identity and morality, uses religion to sanctify power, and crushes dissent as sacrilege. That is Tsarism. And it's a global danger, because Putin's success tempts others. It glamorizes autocracy. It normalizes repression. Freedom is not the norm, it is the exception. And it only survives if we fight for it constantly. So Putin, the Tsar of Russia, may rule until 2036. The real question, however, is how many will follow in his path and how many will resist.